I don't talk very much before the interviews because then you'd save the fun bit for the interview. So don't feel unwelcome.
Okay.
It's
And are we live streaming?
Yeah, it'll be live streaming
to YouTube, presumably.
And it'll all be like, I'll just focus on the most interesting things and we'll have a really fun conversation.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. We are the Systems Change Alliance, and we believe that the world is in need of major change at a systemic level. Change is already happening. And in this series of interviews, we talk to people who are leading change around the world and living the alternatives to the mainstream ways of doing things. Today, we welcome Mark Burton and Carolyn Kagan. Do I say your name correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Mark describes himself as an independent scholar activist, focusing on the relationship between economy, environment, and social justice. Independent scholar activist. So how do you use, how does a scholarly activities help with activism?
Okay. I mean, the term is something, when I retired, having been a kind of a bureaucrat and part-time academic, I found I didn't have a role, which in many ways was great because I was kind of free and not kind of compromised by organizational attachments and so on. But kind of how would I describe myself? How would I kind of continue to be kind of active and do the thing, kind of work on the kinds of things I wanted to do, but have some way of kind of positioning myself? So I thought scholar activist was the kind of rough description that fitted. And it captures both the idea of activism, so campaigning actively, trying to make change, trying to influence systems. So very much the kind of agenda of you, but it being grounded in an understanding of research, of evidence, of theory. In other words, that it isn't just kind of stuff off the top of the head, but it has a basis and is critical. So that was the idea, to kind of pull the two together.
And Carolyn, you come from an academic background, and it says here that you manage a large interdisciplinary research institute.
Yeah.
What's this research institute?
Well, that was a research institute. It was called for Health and Social Change. And it was an interdisciplinary, multi-professional research institute. And one of the things that characterized the work we did, it was always what we call in the university sector engaged research. So it was always in partnership with community groups, with organizations that were delivering public services, and so on. So,
and you've also been involved in other community and voluntary organizations, yeah?
Yeah, all the time. So our research was very grounded, and my own part, the research was nearly always what could broadly be called variants of participatory action research.
Okay, I understand participatory action. That's where you get people to get together and do things to make things better themselves rather than doing things for them, yes?
Yeah, where the university and the university resources are seen as resources for those people trying to do things themselves.
Okay, so you're both here representing Steady State Manchester today. Can you tell me what this is?
Okay, we work on the interface between ecology or environment, economy, and broadly the social and political sphere, social justice. We look at the connections between those things with an emphasis on moving away from dominance by an economy that continually has to grow. And there we're particularly concerned with the kind of the material footprint, the energetic footprint of the economy, and moving towards a situation where that economy does not continue growing materially. So we're both exploring what that means, within the particular context of Greater Manchester in the northwest of England, and also trying to promote those ideas. So it's a kind of a dual thing. We're both learning, figuring out, trying to work out what such an economy and society would look like at that regional scale primarily, but also trying to influence decision makers, movements, campaigning groups, parties, and so on to move in that direction. That's the idea.
And how is the Manchester scene going?
We both better answer that. I think, we're a tiny group. And I think what we can say is that we do seem to have some recognition by other kind of campaigning groups, by some of the politicians and so on. They know about us, they know what we're doing, they know what we stand for. Some of the ideas that we promoted have become more mainstream. So, we've been doing this for 8 years, and some of the things we were talking about at one time seem pretty off the wall, and now they're much more current. Whether that's anything to do with what we've been doing is another matter, because in a way, perhaps we've kind of been kind of at the leading edge of the wave, as it were. So maybe some of these things were coming anyway. You never really quite know. But I think we do, as I say, punch above our weight as a group. And we work, maybe Carolyn can elaborate a bit on this. We have this notion from ecology of the edge. So that area between systems, between social systems, between ecological systems, where different ecosystems meet, different social systems meet, different social groups meet, and we try to work at that edge between the two, because we reckon that you can have much more impact by working at that edge.
Carolyn, what would you say about the community spirit in Manchester?
What did you say?
What would you say about the community movement in this direction in Manchester? Is it going well?
Well, Manchester's a very varied place.
Right.
And it has always prided itself on being radical. And that comes from grassroots movements in the 19th century to the current time. And that radicalness is kind of reflected in the discourses and the rhetoric from politicians. Doesn't always reflect in practice.
Right.
But having said that, I think what we're talking about in Greater Manchester, we're talking about, oh crikey, is it 10 different local authorities? And they all have quite different, so that's administrative regions. And they have quite different characters. One of the things that they have in common is large areas of inequality, huge areas, post-industrial wastelands in the physical environment, quite a disparity in work and worklessness. And that stimulates grassroots movements. So we have the rhetoric of radical progress from the politicians, but there are quite a complex web of grassroots groups working on all sorts of different things to do with, and have been for quite some time, to do with food security, to do with inequality, to do with work, to do with democratic participation and so on. But all of these groups hold very dear to their own purpose.
Right.
Which is, it's common, it's not unique to Manchester, of course. So one of the things that we try to do is to try and maneuver around the spaces where there are common purposes. So to work with groups that are trying to protect areas of the rural environment, at the same time working with groups that are trying to be activist around planning decisions in the urban environment. Because they both have environmental protection in common, but otherwise they have no point of agreement or contact. So that's kind of situation. So when you say, what's it like in Manchester? It's very lively. There's a lot going on, but often in very boundaried groups.
So it's right for some kind of coalition, putting all of these things together in some kind of...
Yeah, but coalitions, we're not exactly a coalition.
No, you're not.
So
but...
Mark can talk about this a bit. Well, no, I'll talk about my bits. What we try and do is form coalitions around issues.
So
if there's a particular
several coalitions,
if there's a particular campaign, we'll try and identify those relevant groups who might have an interest in that campaign and get them to think or work or respond if it's a response that's needed together. And then move on to another issue.
Why did you get involved in these ideas of steady state and not growing economy?
You're better to answer that one, Mark.
Okay. Well, for me, it goes back many years. To kind of show my age, I was active as a student in what was, I suppose, the first wave of the new environmentalism. So around about the time of the foundation of organisations like Friends of the Earth. So I was involved in the very first demonstration Friends of the Earth did in London, which was...
You might need to date that, Mark. So about what, 1971?
Yeah, 70, 71, 72, yeah. So, you know, take campaigning, for example, against the non-returnable bottle, and dumping lots and lots of bottles on the doorstep of Schweppes, campaigning in the university on recycling, collecting lots of waste paper, and then realizing that we hadn't quite thought this one through, and how are we going to get rid of it and get it recycled. But this is the point. Campaignings, picketing the motor shop, and so on. And soon after that appeared the Meadows et al. Book, the Limits to Growth, which, using the methodology of systems dynamics and computer simulation, it showed that if the world's economies went on in the way they were going, which was to kind of continually increase the extraction of resources, to continue the throughput of material resources, pollution, and so on, that there would be a system crash round about now. So that questioning of economic growth was, you know, very much central to the thinking that I was involved in at that time, and many others were. In a way, it was then kind of somewhat sidelined by this notion of sustainable development, which was a kind of real fudge, although with a core of a really good idea that you only develop in ways that won't prejudice the rights and possibilities of future generations. But in a way, it became a kind of fudge. We got these notions of types of green growth and inclusive growth and so on, which were really trying to, I suppose, square the circle of economic growth. But we know that growth forever on a finite planet, you know, it's an impossibility.
Do you think we're early enough to be able to avoid the crash, to be able to just go back into a steady state, or are we really definitely heading for the crash?
I suppose I'm kind of intellectually pessimistic, but volitionally, but politically optimistic. You know, you have to keep on trying. However, we don't really know. And, you know, there are a number of things going on. I mean, who would have thought that in Britain, the Tory government would be talking about things like banning the, you know, bringing the date forward radically for the banning of internal combustion engines in motor cars. Now, clearly, you know, they're not going nearly far enough, but they're talking about, you know, zero carbon economy much earlier than they were previously. So there's these kind of small kind of advances. And
some of them not so small.
Yeah.
No, and again, you can see, in one of the biggest economies, United States or in China, again, moves in that sort of direction to decarbonize and so on. But they're pretty compromised, I think.
What larger steps do you see, Carolyn?
Well, I think some of the recent movement, particularly around climate, that's engaged young people, have the potential, and that's worldwide, but also the Black Lives Matter, again, the spread of some of these movements that engage people who aren't normally involved in politics has the potential to be quite far-reaching.
Yeah, right. So you've described this as viable economy, in a book that you talked about. Can you describe what a viable economy would look like?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned earlier the idea of combining, what we work on is combining a perspective that is about the environment, about the economy, and about society. So our notion of the viable economy is an economy and its society that is viable. In other words, it has the possibility of continuing in ecological terms. It's not going to destroy the planet. In economic terms, that it's an economy that works, that delivers livelihoods for people, that isn't subject to continual sort of boom and bust and crashes and so on. And socially, it provides a good quality of life for the people that depend on it. So that's the idea. We wanted to put this forward as a kind of a positive notion, the viable economy, rather than, we started as Steady State Manchester, which was focusing on this rather boring kind of notion of the steady state economy, which is it's almost defined by negativity, by saying what it isn't, that it's an economy that isn't growing. And similarly, degrowth, post-growth, again, they're very much defined by being the opposite to the dominant thing. So we thought, why don't we put forward a much more positive message, while not fudging, what the real issues are here, but saying this is what we're about. This is what we want to be putting forward. It's a viable economy. It's one that works. It's one that we can live with, which doesn't destroy the very material basis on which human life it relies.
Do you know what that economy would look like?
We've got excuse me. We've got a number of kind of ideas about it. Yeah. So one major theme is relocalization. So it's being and the notion of sufficiency. So relying much more on local provision of food and the kinds of things we need to maintain a life, rather than having to rely on very long supply chains from across the world, bringing stuff in, using huge amounts of energy and so on, destroying environments in the process.
It's the problem with linear speech, linear writing, because at the same time, I'll just interrupt you here, Mark, we recognise that relocalising a northern economy will often devastate global south economies. to have an eye to ensuring that they can also be viable and that they don't depend on products and sometimes services to the global north. Okay, that was just a...
Okay, and then another dimension of that is in terms of finance. So a lot of the emphasis of the economy where we are, and probably in most places, is on competing in the global competition for investment, trying to collar as much as possible of inward investment. But then if you look at it, why would people be investing? They would be investing in order to extract profits. So instead, the notion is what we call endogenous development, looking at using local resources, local wealth, keeping it local, investing it in the things that we need to do locally. So again, it's this notion of a relatively local sufficiency. It's not saying that we have to cut off all ties internationally, that there'll be no trade, but it's kind of rebalancing that. We've talked about things like the spatial dimension. So what will the city and its region look like? And there we can draw on notions like the Garden Cities movement going way back, breaking down the divisions between country and city, re-ruralizing the city region, but also notions like the 20 or 15-minute neighborhood, where many of the things that you need are within walking distance of your home, and therefore you have not having to kind of ship people across the city, again using vast amounts of energy, tying people's time up in traveling, commuting, in congestion, and so on. And again, it's about changing the conversation, changing the focus, so that we have different criteria for success than gross domestic product, gross value added, and so on. And we're looking at a much broader kind of range of measures of success in terms of people's prosperity, and people in terms of equality, in terms of people's income, but also in terms of its impact on the natural world, on the environment, the amount of energy used, and so on. And within all that, then there has to be the restoration, the protection of the natural world, and that is a key kind of element in it, because that's what we all depend upon. And then within that, things like that things that fall out of it are things like renewable energy, about ensuring that we insulate our buildings, all those kinds of notions, which I guess are pretty familiar to people who will be interested in these issues.
Go and get a glass of water. I'll ask Carolyn some questions.
Yes, I'll do that.
So, Carolyn, would you add anything to what Mark said?
Well, I was just thinking while he was talking about the 15-minute neighbourhood. One of the things that we're able to do in our very small collective, which we didn't say at the beginning, is a group of, I can't remember how many we are now, about 6, but we all come from different places and have different interests. And one of the interests within the group is to say, well, okay, if you were thinking about 15-minute neighbourhoods, that's easy to write a policy outline about what that would look like, but what does it take to move to a 15-minute neighbourhood? And you can't have a walkable neighbourhood without having a neighbourhood that has less traffic. So our cities are completely clogged up with cars, like most of them. So then that leads to questions about, so what do we do about traffic? And how can we mobilise local interests to reduce traffic? And paradoxically, the pandemic has helped us in this, because our streets have been mostly empty of traffic for long periods of time. So people can see that actually there's another way to live and another way to use the urban space. And more people have been walking and cycling in the urban space because it's safe to do so. So that's just an example of taking sort of a high level idea and then taking it right down to its implementation, and thinking about what it takes, and experimenting with trying to mobilize it bottom up on the same issues that obviously have to be addressed top down as well.
So how would you reduce the traffic?
Well, I'll give you a specific example. Again, from the pandemic, and again, this is another thing about kind of our thinking about how to work, coming down to the micro sort of level, is where we live, there are mutual aid groups that are all busy decorating Christmas windows at the moment. and share things and help people and all of this kind of stuff. So how do we then take that to the next level? So within our mutual aid groups, we started talking about how can we make this traffic reduction that we're seeing during the pandemic permanent. And we had lots of Zoom meetings with neighbours and all of this kind of stuff, and there was conflict and there were disagreements, but we came up with a proposal to put to our local administration to reduce traffic coming through our residential streets. They've kind of half accepted that proposal. We've yet to see whether it will actually come into play. But so we'd say, well, okay, well, what would they accept? They might accept something. And what will neighbours accept? The ones that are sceptical. Mm. Well, maybe an experiment. Mm. So do it on a temporary basis, and let's see, let's monitor, let's collect data. Not an expert coming in and collecting data. Let's collect that data ourselves, so we can see what impact it has. So that's at a kind of, that's at a what are we talking about? 250 houses at that sort of level of street stuff. So then
go on.
Sorry?
Go on. I'll add something in when you finish.
But that won't do anything while people still have their cars and want to drive them. So there has to be some kind of both pressure and the kind of all the stuff that people talk about social comparison. Some people, they make it the best thing not to have a car or to have only a very little car, rather than to have 3 cars per household. So make that the social value rather than the best and biggest car. Of course, we're up against in that all the advertising and all the marketing and all the policies that support and particularly hydrocarbon fuels. So we won't do anything just bottom up on reducing traffic, unless suddenly if everybody wakes up and decides not to use their car. But it's a really interesting microcosm of seeing the complexity of what seems to be quite a singular and simple issue, reduced traffic. But it's actually one that involves policy, it involves behavior change, it involves cultural change, and it involves the policy things would have to change how the tax system works to support or to encourage, at the moment, to encourage relatively cheap fuel and so on, coupled with advances to create different kinds of fuel and so on. But just to say we're going to move towards a 20-minute walkable neighbourhood is extraordinarily complex within one neighbourhood, never mind within a country or within the across the world. Sorry, Mark, you were going to say something.
Yeah, well, I was going to kind of add another dimension there. So don't get the idea that we kind of only think about or only work at the very micro local level. So if people are going to use their cars less, maybe not have cars, use an alternative. What are the alternatives within the city? Well, the alternatives are active travel, so using bikes and walking and so on, but also public transport and a decent public transport. And one of the campaigns that we've got behind and been part of, an active part of, is Better Buses Greater Manchester, for example, where in the UK, some 30 plus years ago, public transport, the buses were deregulated by the Thatcher government, and it became basically a market free-for-all. So any company can come in, set up as a bus company, and chase the profitable routes and basically cut routes where it's not profitable. So the whole thing is organised in terms of profit rather than in terms of social need. And we have the opportunity in Greater Manchester of moving to a re-regulated system of buses, which gives you the possibility then of actually having a planned system. You decide where the routes should be, you decide the fare structure, you cross-subsidise the unpopular routes or the lower volume routes from the highly popular ones. You tie it in together with the trams, with the railways and other forms of transport. So that's a campaign, and there was a mass consultation which was extremely popular in terms of the agreement to actually do something about this. We've got an 83% agreement on a popular, a massive consultation that this should be done. Then the pandemic came in and it threw all the kind of the economic and financial calculations. So they're having to go through another phase of that. But it's an example of how we get involved in the policy level as well as at the kind of the micro campaigning level.
There's another example that's still linked to this idea of a walkable neighbourhood, because I'm always reminded of something that Jan Gehl, who was the city architect for Copenhagen, said. If you want to have a city for people, you have to design out cars. And so there's the whole area of urban design and urban planning that feeds into this idea of a walkable neighbourhood. And one of the things, again, that we've been able to do is to link with a number of community groups that are concerned with the planning system to try and get together to have a sort of a coordinated response to some proposals that the government is putting out to change how the planning system works. So at the one level, it's active travel, get people to walk, stop use their cars, but at the same time deal with public transport, at the same time deal with urban design, at the same time deal with culture change, at the same time lobby on tax reform. So it's trying to kind of firstly understand that complexity and then work at those little bits where you think you might be able to make a difference.
And that's quite interesting, because I think one thing that we can do, we mentioned this notion of working at the edge, working at the intersection of the different kind of campaigns, the different kind of interest groups, is that we find that we can get people in the same room or the same Zoom screen from very different campaigns who wouldn't otherwise come into contact. So you're housing in activists and environmental and climate change activists, people working on tax justice and on financial reform, together with people working very much on questions of homelessness and so on. People working on poverty, people working on the whole question of green space in the city region. So that gets really interesting, I think, when you get those connections between the groups and people working together on the areas that they can agree with. And again, we try as much as possible to kind of frame this stuff within this overall notion of the viable economy as an alternative way of thinking about the future, and specifically the future of our city region.
Have you heard how they got rid of traffic in Curitiba in Brazil?
A bit, yeah.
There was
tell us more.
It was a more top-down approach. It was like one visionary man and his friends who made it happen.
Yeah.
But they actually had a lot of popular resistance, and they were very clever about getting it through. In Brazil, at the time, there did not exist a pedestrian mall in any city, let alone that city. So nobody had the concept of having pedestrian streets without cars. And this mayor decided that we weren't going to build highways through the streets and knock down old buildings. We were going to keep the old buildings. He was an architect. He liked the old buildings. That was his thing. And so we're going to keep the old buildings. We're going to just reduce the traffic. And so he said, right, we're putting in pedestrian malls, not just one. We're putting in a whole set of pedestrian malls through the center and banning cars through the center. and putting in buses everywhere so that people can get there. So he got resistance, and then Automobile Association, the Car Drivers Association, organized a rally where they would drive through the streets that he had just banned cars from. And he said, yeah, okay, you can do that. And he organized another event on the same day. So when the cars arrived and they're getting ready to drive through these streets, there are thousands of children doing drawings on the streets with chalk. You know, who wins? Obviously the children win. And so it was like the brilliant creative expressions that were able to make the impact on people and make the change in a very fast time. So they took a kind of different route. They didn't do as much consultation, did a lot more brilliant visionary creativity and just said, right, we're going to do it. But I guess that that takes a certain kind of person to have and to manage to get in power to be able to.
It does, and I think a lot of our leaders are kind of, they have some of those ideas and they have some ambitions which are, you know, very much in the right direction, but they're also pulled in the other direction. So part of our job is to kind of encourage them in the right direction. So you know, on this buses thing, you know, our Metropolitan Mayor wants to re-regulate, and part of the function of the campaign that I mentioned is to give him support in doing that. To kind of keep him on the straight and narrow, as it were, to do the right thing, and you know, and with that we can work, you know, and we do work not as the leading group, but as part of that kind of alliance of a variety of groups.
I liked what you said, Carolyn, about how did you put it? Making people interested in having a smaller car, because this is like the social pressure. This is the thing that people desire. So I would describe that as jealousy. So this is environmentalism by jealousy. If we can make people envious of an environmental lifestyle, then the job is done. No?
One of the challenges that we face in Manchester is Greater Manchester is a really good example of one of the problems across the whole of the United Kingdom and other countries. And that is of disparity in wealth, disparity in health. So in our own city, we have a 10-year difference in life expectancy between one part of the city and the next. And so we have great swathes of less affluent areas of where there are high in worklessness. And people, somebody, not everybody obviously, but some people in those areas, one of the aspirations is to have a car. It's one of the things that they've not been able to do and they want to be able to do. But when you get, so you get different kinds of resistances, popular resistance. You get popular resistance from the car drivers who think we should be able to drive wherever we want and park wherever we want, and who's anybody to say we shouldn't. But you also have popular resistance from more marginalized communities who aspire to that lifestyle. So that's it's a challenge in this whole area of work. So we can say on paper that low-income communities are low carbon emitters and live a more sustainable life, but they don't want to be living that kind of life. Their aspirations are to be higher consumers and to live more like the affluent areas. So there's something about demonstrating the value of a more sustainable, livable way of living that isn't just about celebrating how poorer people already live. And that can be quite a dilemma, both in face-to-face discussions and campaigns, as well as on paper in written arguments.
My observation is that people really love living in strong community once they experience it. But they don't get it from talking about it. They have to actually experience it. So we've had a lot of people living with us in our house and creating a kind of community sense in our house. And I was very clear that I didn't want something like the popular share house where people have their own rooms and they never really see each other. I wanted something where people are really interacting and engaged with each other. And we created something like this. And a lot of people come kind of scared of that. They kind of go, you know, I'm not sure that would really work for me. And so I don't even promote the idea a lot of the time. I just say, you know, there's a spare room.
Yeah.
But when people come and say, this is the way we live.
Yeah.
But after staying with us for a month or two, a lot of people say, this is amazing. I'm going to go home and do this myself.
Yeah.
Because the experience of it is so profound. And it, you know, all of the fears that people have about how you lose your privacy and what kind of stresses and conflicts you have and all of these things, they're not true. You know, in a well-running community, it's a very much a supportive.
And at that level, one way to do that is almost what you described as a kind of, you're not doing as an experiment, but people who visit you are being able to test it out, not on a permanent basis. They're not having to commit, but they're able to see that things could be different. And if you scale that up to consumption and to waste and to finance, I think some of the same principles can still operate. That there are lots of experiments going on. There's loads and loads. I think on your website you talk about Naomi Klein's notion of joining the dots. There are lots and lots of dots worldwide going on, but they're not always well known about. They're not always, the communication of them isn't always good. It doesn't get to everybody. So the people who are interested in this kind of stuff get to see what's going on in these kinds of small scale transformations. But that's not going to be enough. It's the people who at the moment aren't interested that we need to be able to get to experiment and see that there are different ways of doing things.
Mm-hmm. In the west of Sydney, there was a small street where they did a community development program. And I saw it after something like 10 years after the start of the program. It was really inspiring. So the story was that this was the worst, most crime-ridden street in the whole of Sydney.
Mm-hmm.
And they sent in one community development officer who stayed there for some months, failed to do anything in those months, couldn't get people to talk to each other, nothing. And eventually he did a barbecue in the street, and people came and joined in the barbecue in the street and started talking to each other. Mm-hmm. And he said to them, after some time in the barbecue and we were kind of having a good time, he said to them, you know, it's kind of pretty terrible around here, isn't it? He said, yeah. Do you want to do something about it? They said, yeah. What do you want to do? And they said, let's clean up the street. And the next weekend, they cleaned up several tons of rubbish from the street. And they appreciated they'd done that, and it was better. And they had this experience, and they were happy to take the next step and the next step. And so he's been continuing working with them for some years. And then every step, they just take the next step and the next step and the next step. Now they have community gardens in between all of the houses. And they have a series of people from different nationalities who grow and eat different food. And there's even some plants which some nationalities eat the top and some nationalities eat the root. So they harvest them together and they say, you have this bit, I'll take this bit, because we cook different food.
Yeah.
And then the very big Samoan Islanders took to patrolling the streets at night singing Christian songs to stop the crime. And so they have this very, very particular community that's very, very strong. And now it's like, it's an amazing place. And of course, it's not stopping there. It's like, okay, what's the next step and what's the next step and what's the next step? And having something like this sounds like it has potential. This is like, it's not just, yeah, we made one little step and things are a little bit better. It's like this increasing, accelerating wheel that's going to go faster and faster. And I think that's kind of what we need to be creating, these kind of communities that are feeling and diving into more and more of the good things they can create together.
And I think there are some possibilities at the moment. So I think what's been quite interesting about the pandemic is how people have been kind of thrown back on their locality in many ways. So, you know, around here, we didn't used to know many of the people in the same street, and now we're kind of much more in contact with them. And there are small things happening, small kind of shared local projects. I mean, the short term, they're things like, you know, let's decorate the street together for Christmas. But you know, they never worked like that before. So I think, you know, some of that could continue. Some of that could be developed. And again, if you think about that across the many neighbourhoods, not just our own, there are some possibilities there.
There are some examples, not in Greater Manchester, unfortunately, but certainly in the United Kingdom, where these kinds of approaches, where you start with people talking to each other, are used to develop kind of social work opportunities. So work that is actually going to be useful and is needed by the community for people that don't have work at the moment. And that then becomes transformative in lots of different ways. So not only do community gaps in things that the community needs get filled, but people gain employment, they gain a sense of purpose, and so on. And those schemes can make use of and exploit some of the same systems that are used to contribute to a more destructive type of economy. So I'm thinking particularly in terms of things like training opportunities for young people. So if they get those kinds of schemes organized properly, then they can use those training opportunities. They're not just the big corporates that use those training opportunities and use those resources to carry on doing business the same. And certainly there's not very many examples, 3 I know of in the country, where those work-oriented and job-oriented participatory processes have really transformed very desolate places where generations of people have not had paid employment, but who now do. Some people, not everybody, it's not solved the whole problem of those areas, but it has begun to show that there are different ways of organizing for income that is combined with meeting community needs. And one of the things that kind of is within our viable economy idea is to support the development of cooperative work opportunities. But that, certainly in the United Kingdom, is people can, almost without risk to themselves, experiment with creative cooperatives, care cooperatives, growing cooperatives, and so on. But that's a different model of organisation. One that if that were to
the BEC, the Business and Employment Cooperatives of France.
Yeah, it could be, yes, including them. Yeah, sure. And the biggest one is, sorry?
That's a model that might work for this.
Yeah, yeah. I think the one local authority, it's a place called Barking and Dagenham in the southeast of England, where they've been doing this participatory in sort of job creation. I've now got, I think the last thing that I saw was 500 people involved in some kind of an enterprise who weren't involved before. which is a huge number of people in quite a small area. This was a district that really had one major industry. It was actually the car industry, but they pulled out, and then there was nothing. So there's really very little going on in this place. But now there's an awful lot of stuff going on, which is, it's really interesting about in our literature, we talk about looking at the possibilities of job guarantees and universal basic income as ways of trying to encourage solidarity work while still being able to live. But this participatory economy, these participatory ways of job creation, I think are probably more transformative than either of those are. And is a model, I don't think would stand a chance really of getting it off the ground in Manchester. And the reason for that is what I said right early on about the rhetoric of we're all very radical in Manchester, because the people that are that hold all the resources for job creation and training think they're doing progressive stuff already. So it's not like nothing's happening where you can then start building something. It's about they think that they're holding on very precious to what they're doing because they think it's really good. So it's not the best.
It's funny. I actually find sometimes it's worth going to the people that you would expect to be the enemy.
Yeah.
The right wing people and promoting the ideas there, because they tend to be doers. And if you can convince them that it's a good idea, it often actually happens. I find that the left-wing alternatives tend to be thinkers, and they've got some really good ideas, but they don't know what happened. So I'd like to take some of the good ideas and plant them in the fertile ground over the other side, other side of the fence.
Yeah.
But it's trying to get people to think of themselves as doers, as creators, as entrepreneurs, but not in a corporate sense.
Yeah, I think there comes an issue of personal development as well, because those people who start conventional businesses, they do it out of a certain selfish interest, yes, and starting co-ops it's not really a selfish thing to do. It's a very giving, altruistic kind of thing. And there's plenty of altruistic people out there, but what altruistic people are there who have enough passion and zeal to go out there and create a business? It's bloody hard work, you know? So, you know, the certain level of personal development that's necessary to be that kind of passionate, altruistic leader who is able to create these things.
But sometimes I think, particularly if you're thinking of collective and cooperative ways, people can enthuse each other, and sometimes they go way out into fantasy and so nothing that's possibly going to work because they get so excited about some utopian notion. But other times that they enthuse each other, so you don't get that individual passion and commitment that you might have with a single business development. But with a cooperative development, you get a different kind of enthusiasm and commitment, I think. Right.
And perhaps there's a different kind of personal growth that happens from being part of a community and enthusing each other. Yeah.
And sometimes it's about asking the right question at the right time. So another example from our local area, and it's a pandemic example again, unfortunately, but there's lots of interesting things that happened in the pandemic. And one of them was some people who, I think, during the pandemic, we were allowed, when we had our big lockdown, we were allowed out for half an hour exercise. That was the rule.
Right.
People that ride bikes, quite like to be out for longer than half an hour. So some people who were friends who rode bikes got together, said, let's form a bicycle delivery service, then we can ride our bikes around all day. So they did that. They formed a bicycle delivery service. It was it grew. I think there's about 30 people involved now. And they formed a very useful community service during the pandemic. Then somebody asked the question, what if we made this permanent? They hadn't thought about making it permanent. They were all volunteers, all just liked cycling around. But they are now, having thought about that question and looked at some possible answers, they're now forming a bicycle delivery workers co-op.
Wow, fantastic.
That will provide not only a permanent service, but income for some people. So sometimes it's just about kind of harnessing what's there already. Another example in a completely different sphere. We had, again, in our locality, and I think it's worth just thinking about the locality because these things happen in other places as well. We had a group of people that were interested in co-housing. So this is not quite communal living, but shared amenities and living close to each other and so on. And they were always looking out for opportunities to either develop from an existing building or a new build a co-housing project. And the question was asked, have you thought of forming a community land trust? What's a community land trust? They had no idea. So they were put in touch with people who knew about community land trusts. And for viewers, a community land trust is a community ownership of land, basically, in perpetuity, that is focused on either social housing or on community amenities. So they formed a community land trust. Thought, well, that's a good way to organise ourselves as a co-housing group. Then an opportunity came up for a very large ex-cinema building that had been used as a funeral home for years and years and years, was on the market. As a community land trust, they thought we could turn this into a community amenity, nothing to do with co-housing, but a community amenity, a hub with some social housing involved and some exhibition space and cafes and performance spaces and so on. And that's what they're now doing. They're now working on negotiating the sale of that building to form a community hub. That's miles away from a co-housing project. But by asking the question, have you thought of becoming a land trust? That opened up all sorts of possibilities for them. And they are now almost at the point of being able to buy that building to turn it into a community hub.
Lovely.
Both those examples that Carolyn mentioned are really quite interesting, I think, in terms of the bigger picture as well. So if we take the bike delivery co-op, one of the big issues that kind of faces urban areas in terms of carbon emissions, in terms of the quality of life, in terms of air pollution, in terms of congestion and noise and so on, is this problem of the final mile deliveries, where there's, particularly with the shift from retail shops to internet buying and so on, there's an awful lot of these kind of white vans flying the streets and delivering stuff, and it's becoming a huge problem. And how do you where do you get started to try and begin to shift that? And some of that might be at that level of small groups of people setting up local cooperatives to do some of that kind of work in a different kind of way, in a much more kind of ecologically sensitive way. And at the same time, that could then connect potentially to bigger initiatives. So, at the kind of the regional level, could you begin to scale that up and make that begin to happen? Get some seed money in to help that happen and so on. Well, one of the things we proposed in one of our pieces of work 4 years ago, when there were elections for the Metropolitan Mayor, was the idea of a cooperative development agency. And that's now being set up. Not because we said so, I don't think, but it's happening anyway. It's a good idea. So but you can begin to see how some of these things, like the the local umbrella cooperative that Carolyn mentioned, some of the initiatives could be connected together, along with some of the aspirations about being a green city, reducing the overall carbon footprint of the city and so on. Likewise, the example of the Community Land Trust and taking over and regenerating, revitalizing a community, a building as a community space. Again, that begins to answer some of those questions about how do you refocus on the level of the sufficient neighborhood, as opposed to having to always go outside for everything that you need. So I think these connections get really interesting, both in terms of connections between people, connections locally, but also connections between different agendas and connections at different scales.
In Steady State Manchester, these examples are stories we can tell, and sometimes activities and campaigns we can get involved with. But at the same time, we'd be challenging some of the more progressive ways of arguing for green growth or inclusive growth. So we wouldn't be stopping at the local story level. We'd be challenging some of those really high level policies. And sometimes, well, that's an example where there aren't very many detractors of green and inclusive growth. It's an idea that people have grasped with great enthusiasm, certainly from the left, the political left. And yet we have some reservations about that. We have a reservation about the whole, from where we started in this conversation, the whole idea of any kind of growth, as far as it's not possible without, if you're really taking seriously environmental stewardship.
At least not in the physical realms. Growth of knowledge isn't so bad.
Yeah, and growth of some things physically. We're not against that. We want more renewable energy. We want more insulation fitting. We want more bikes. We want more public transport. But for that to happen, other things have got to shrink.
So if people, do you have any projects, movements that people could get involved with?
You mean kind of
like stalling on that?
Sounds like a no.
No, it's not a no, but it's kind of thinking about kind of the who and where, and what are the interests. So yeah, there are many kind of possibilities, but I don't think we can simply sort of say, yeah, get involved in this. I mean, for some people, they might want to get involved in Steady State Manchester, in our collective. Elsewhere, people might want to try and set up something similar.
Yeah, okay. So
great, have a Steady State London, a Steady State, Edinburgh, whatever. Focusing on, a viable Edinburgh or a viable Bristol or whatever.
The two obvious directions. You can get involved in this, or you can start something.
And then there's the local campaigns, the local groups, and so on, and also the kind of the national and international connections. I mean, we're part of our connection with yourselves is kind of evidence that we are part of a broader kind of movement, a broader network, and there's a lot of possibilities.
So how do people get in touch with you if they do want to get involved?
Oh well, we can. Probably the best place to look is our website, steadystatemanchester.net. Steady State Manchester, all one word, .net. Search that, you can find how to contact us, you can read some of our materials, and we can connect you with other groups, if that's kind of your interest, and suggest other possibilities.
So in conclusion, what are the key systemic changes you think the world needs?
What did you say? What are the key changes?
Key systemic changes the world needs. Well, there's so many.
Give us your short list.
I think a big part of it is a change of emphasis, a change of conversation. So it's a change from competition, from growth, from expansion to one based on kindness, on conviviality, on sufficiency, on getting what's needed, getting just enough of what's needed for people to live a decent life and no more. And that then begins to move out into areas of extraction, mining, fossil fuel consumption, but also the way we live, the way we organize, the way we live our lives. I mean, it's so interconnected. I think it's a little hard to say, yeah, this is the one thing, the one silver bullet. If you pick that one, everything else will fall into place, because it doesn't work like that.
Mm. What would you say, Carolyn?
Well, I'd probably say we need a lot more international understanding and solidarity.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to understand other people much better. And, well, yeah, so understand solidarity, a sense of a global community, not a local community. So because we need a much stronger sense that this is the crises that we're facing are common, whether they're conflict crises, environmental crises, economic crises, or whatever.
We can't compete our way out of this.
We're all interconnected.
Mm.
And so we need we need to move towards, it sounds terrible, we need to move towards a less selfish outlook and a more collective outlook.
Mm-hmm. Okay, lovely. Thank you for having. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Really interesting talk. Yep.
Yeah.
By all means, we'll respond to anybody who contacts us.
Yeah.
Lovely.